Today we're looking at the top 10 lies you're told about American slavery. There are large groups of historical revisionists that have a vested interest in trying to downplay it or reshape it in a way that's more comfortable for their agendas.
Yeah, and you're not at all like that, are ya?
There are also some people that have grown up with an overly simplistic version of slavery.
And as we'll see, you're one of them.
Number 10. Abolitionism was a popular northern movement.
This one is actually pretty good. I'll give him this one.
The idea that Union armies marched with the intention of freeing slaves is integral to the romanticization of the American Civil War and the idolizing of Abraham Lincoln. It gave a long, grueling war a sense of purpose that was meant to help everyone feel better about the end result. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1862, it led to a spike in desertions among Union troops, some of whom were explicit about how emancipation was the motivating factor. In brief, it could hardly have been said that the average soldier would have been moved by a speech about freeing slaves.
So he's saying it's not as simple as North is abolitionist and South is pro-slave. That's good. And I'm sure he's not gonna go against this in any way when he starts talking about Southern soldiers, right?
Number 9. The American Civil War was not about slavery.
Get ready for the fail.
In order to defend fetishizing the Confederate flag, or rather the Army of Northern Virginia's battle flag,
Tennessee's, actually. Northern Virginia's was square.
The lie has been spread that the Civil War was fought over the rights of states, not the freeing of slaves.
It was undeniably fought over the right of states to secede from the Union. The South wanted to secede, so they did. The North didn't want them to, so they waged war against them.
There are a number of aspects that can be cited to support this claim, such as the fact that Lincoln himself denied that the war was about slavery in the early days. However, the Southern states all included in their declarations of causes for their rebellion that it was either the superiority of white races or the issue of slavery.
Lie, 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 lie! Some Southern states did that, but you can't just read the secession documents of a couple of states and pretend that applies to the rest. Virginia, Arkansas, Missouri, and Kentucky gave as their reason Northern aggression against the Southern states, not slavery, although Missouri and Kentucky ended up not seceding. Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee gave no reason. In fact, some of them, including Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, had met earlier to decide whether to secede over slavery and decided not to. Slavery was not a good enough reason to secede, according to them. It was only when they were forced to choose sides in a war.
Number 8. Slaves fought for the Confederacy. When someone wants to claim that the American Civil War was about defending homes,
why wouldn't it be about defending homes for many people? If an invading army is coming to kill your family, would you think, this war is to free the slaves, so I guess I'll let them kill my family? Give me a break! Oh, something you didn't mention. Less than 15% of Southern households owned even a single slave. It was only the richest Southerners who could afford slaves. And those big plantations were only the top 1 or 2%. There is no way that poor Southerners would have risked their lives in a war to maintain the lifestyle of those uppity rich slave owners.
All black people, even those freeborn, were banned from serving as soldiers in the Confederate armies,
which didn't stop them from doing so. A lot of unit commanders just neglected to note the person's skin color when they signed up to be another person on the battlefield. I mean, what would you do in that position? Wouldn't you want there to be more people out there shooting at the enemy?
Number 7. Slaves were rarely killed by labor.
Okay, this one is pretty dumb, so I'll let him have it. Even if none of them were killed, it still doesn't justify owning another human being. But he is being very homogeneous. How nicely or brutally a slave was treated depended on the individual slave owner. Whistler's being incredibly simple-minded again.
Freed slaves took control of Southern governments after the American Civil War.
You're supposed to be talking about slavery, Simon, not what happened after. But I've talked about this before. The atrocities you mentioned were only able to happen because they restricted the right of freed slaves to own firearms. Really interesting the parts you're leaving out here.
Slaves were only owned by the wealthiest.
Covered that.
However, you have to consider that among the people that fought for the Southern armies, such as the Army of Northern Virginia, slave ownership was much more common than you think. 1 in 10 soldiers owned slaves.
So just the top 10%? Less than the 15% Confederacy-wide that owned slaves? Simon, you're defeating your own point!
In the officer class, half were slave owners.
Because the rich were ones who became officers, moron!
If there were soldiers that fought only for states' rights, they were certainly not the overwhelming majority.
90% isn't an overwhelming majority? That's your own figure, Whistler!
Even if the South won the Civil War, slavery would have ended shortly after.
According to pretty much every economic analysis that's ever been done.
Some claim it was dying out on its own. For one thing, the fact that every major trading partner for the Confederacy had outlawed slavery
without having to resort to a war. In fact, in the whole world, out of all the countries that have ended slavery, only 2 ended it with violence, the United States and Haiti. Everyone else ended it peacefully. And even at that, throughout the 19th century and ramping up into the 1850s, slavery had to be maintained with more and more protectionist legislation like the Fugitive Slave Acts, which relieved slave owners of the expense of having to catch runaway slaves. That was now done on the taxpayer's dime. Slavery is actually a drag on the economy. It's fairly unsustainable once you get a good amount of economic activity going.
In fact, though, slavery was so profitable at the time that an average slave owner could expect a 100% return on their investment within 10 years.
Citation needed.
Further, there's the fact that nearly a century later, Nazi Germany put millions of people into highly profitable slave labor.
How was it profitable? The Nazis drove their economy into the ground!
The first slaves in America were white people.
Yep, something like 2 to 3 million Irish and 1 to 2 million Germans, among others.
Irish people certainly were put into forced labor under the more sophisticated-sounding label, indentured servitude,
which really isn't any different.
Well, there were significant, immediate, tangible differences between indentured servants and slaves.
No, there aren't.
Indentured servants still retained basic human rights.
No, they didn't!
Neither they nor their children were designated property.
Yes, they were! Fuck, Whistler, where are you getting this crap from?
It was contractually possible to get out of indentured servitude through labor.
No, it wasn't. Only if the person specifically agreed to it to work off a debt. Otherwise, it was for life. And by the way, they were punished just as harshly for disobedience as black slaves were, like you mentioned earlier. In fact, many were even burned alive. African slaves were often treated better than Irish slaves because at least Africans weren't filthy Catholics. The reason why black slaves ended up being favored had nothing to do with racism, but the fact that, their ancestors having adapted to a tropical climate, they could work better in the heat. Try getting a ginger little Irishman to work in the heat all day and see how well he does.
Slavery was a Southern problem.
Okay, here's another good one. Northern states, as he said, were often not only slave states, but also active supporters of slavery. And in fact, the Triangle trade ships would land at the port of Boston, not Charleston. And this kept on being the case even after those states banned slavery.
Slavery is illegal in America.
And we're back to the crap. The 13th Amendment made all forms of slavery and involuntary servitude illegal except for prison labor, which according to him is exactly the same thing.
25% of all people that are incarcerated in the world are in the United States.
Yes, and that's a huge issue. But prison labor is not the norm today. In fact, only about 18% of prisoners today are convict workers, and that's not counting those that are ineligible because of age or health reasons. Besides, didn't you yourself earlier say that someone being released after a certain term meant that they didn't count as slaves, only indentured servants? Not seeing much consistency here, Simon. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, why not hit like and subscribe? And to make sure I can produce more, support this channel on Patreon and Maker Support. And check out all the other great content here, like this video selected especially for you.